Do you have a DonorsChoose.org project that needs funding? Today's sponsor is Advancement Courses, and they are donating 10% of their sales until September 28th to DonorsChoose.org projects. And if you're needing professional development for yourself, you get 20% off their 200-plus online PD courses using the special code just for 10-minute teacher listeners. So stay tuned at the end of the show. Geo Inquiry in Project-Based Learning, Episode 363. The 10-Minute Teacher Podcast with Vicki Davis. Every weekday, you'll learn powerful, practical ways to be a more remarkable teacher today. Today, we're talking with Jim Bentley, fifth grade teacher from California and co-author of the National Geographic Geo-Inquiry Education Guide. And a big shout out to our mutual friend, Susie Boss, who told me about Jim. Jim, what is Geo Inquiry?
Geo Inquiry really is project-based learning with a geographic perspective, Vicki. Students ask questions that are geographically centered. They collect geospatial data. They try to visualize that data, look for patterns, look for trends. And then ultimately, the goal is to create a story that drives or supports an action based on what they've learned or found out.
Okay, so give me an example of what this looks like in your classroom.
An example of this from last year, we started asking where water was located in our community as a result of reading this book, A Long Walk to Water by Linda Sue Park. And what kids realized was that we've got water all over the place. But one of the things that we were reading about and learning about was plastics and marine plastics. So we started with a question of how can we increase access to water in our schools and parks, but reduce plastic waste. So ultimately, the geospatial part was going out to our city and doing a transect from east to west. And we literally mapped where we could find water, be it water stations in restaurants and fast food places, water fountains, and so forth. What we realized was that water is highly accessible like we thought, but we also realized that there's no bottle filling stations anywhere in our schools or even in our parks. So ultimately, as they were looking at the mapping data that they collected, they created a story, and that story was really tailored for our Parks and Rec district and our school district. And the action that my students wanted to take was, how can we increase the number of bottle filling stations, which makes water more accessible, but also reduces plastic waste? So it starts with asking questions and it ends with action.
Okay, so did they have any success?
They did. It was really exciting. The very last week of the school year last year, we installed our very first bottle filling station at the park right next to our school. So our Parks and Rec district, which manages 97 parks, they're starting to install bottle filling stations as they're taking out old fountains that need to be retrofitted. So that was a big one for us.
Okay, so Geo Inquiry is project-based learning. It sounds like you're integrating more than just geography in here. You're integrating science, you're integrating other things, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. One of the common misperceptions that a lot of students have because of misperceptions that teachers have is that geography is about, just maps and place names and locations. And really, when we're talking about geography, we're really trying to look at it from kind of a prismatic perspective, looking at it from like economics and political perspectives, looking at it from historical or cultural perspectives. So, yeah, there's a lot more than just place names and locations. The economics, of bottle filling stations, the spatial location, but also then the cultural norms. One of the things we learned was that middle schoolers are really not excited about water fountains. They just don't like them. And there's NIH reports that support that. So it's really kind of a cultural thing. But when you look at perceptions towards, say, bottle filling stations, the research shows that kids are more amenable to that. And they actually like those better than fountains. So yeah, geography is just one part of it.
Now, how long have you been using the Geo Inquiry method?
I started using this method as it's written currently about 2 years ago, but I've been teaching with a project-based learning perspective and from a geo-inquiry perspective since about, say, 2006, before it was really, like a thing. Our first big project, we looked at where running tracks were located in our school district and why old schools didn't necessarily have running tracks like the new schools had. So we worked with state budget analysts and lobbyists, and we looked at how money was being spent, and we lobbied our district to start retrofitting old schools with running tracks. So that was kind of a geographic launch. Since that time, a lot of our geo-inquiries have really revolved around waste and waste management, recycling, household hazardous waste, things like that. Where are these things generated? Where are these things disposed of? And how should they be disposed of? And how can we generate less of them? So yeah, you bring in a lot of science, a lot of math, a lot of reading and writing. It's very cross-curricular.
Yeah, and social entrepreneurship, because kids want to do work that matters. Now, how much time does a project like this take up? Do you spend a little bit of time on it every day? Do you have a large block of time once or twice a week? How do you manage that in with your regular flow of work in fifth grade?
That's a great question. Typically when we're working on math, or we're working on a writing concept, or we're working on, something that's a science concept, and in a non-project based learning classroom, you might kind of segregate those topics and you might teach them in discrete blocks. With a project-based learning classroom and with activities like this, sometimes you've got these periods of time, these work sessions where some of those concepts are being brought in, or sometimes you might take your project and sort of farm out parts of it or aspects of it during your math block or during your reading or during your writing block. So the question is, there's no one set day or schedule, but typically toward the end of a project, as we're really trying to fine tune it, we'll have more dedicated work times, maybe, an hour and a half, 2-3 times a week. But otherwise, it's really teaching, just integrating the project into those teaching moments.
Are there some common mistakes that teachers make when they start the geo-inquiry model?
Sometimes teachers might not spend enough time up front really working on the geo-inquiry question itself. You really want to make sure that you've got a solid geo-inquiry question to work with that has characters, it has an action, it has a succinct way to kind of encapsulate the project. So for example, our question last year was, how can we make water more accessible and reduce plastic waste in our parks and schools? Having such a clear question really helps the teacher guide the students, but it also helps the students stay on track. I'd say another thing that could be a challenge if a teacher's not careful is thinking about how you're going to coordinate the explicit instruction moments with standards that have to be taught with the elements of the project. It's not you do the teaching and then you do the project in addition to. It's really the project is the vehicle that carries the teaching. So sometimes teachers kind of get stuck with, well, how do you do the project and try to teach at the same time? The teaching's folded into the project. So not divorcing those, that's another thing that really I find I have to work with teachers when I'm training them for the Buck Institute for Education.
PBL is a very different model of teaching. Once you're used to it, you love it. It can be a little bit of an adjustment. Was it an adjustment for you, Jim?
Yeah, it was years ago, and it still is today because, every class is different and every project's different. I couldn't imagine going back to just covering topics anymore. That would absolutely make me cringe to think of, covering stuff, fertilizers for covering, teachings for deep inquiry, right?
And I'm sure you talk with teachers all over the place. You have a teacher who's genuinely interested, but they're a little bit nervous about how is this going to change their traditional fifth grade or traditional elementary, middle, high school classroom. What's your best answer for how this looks compared to what maybe you did before you used geo-inquiry?
I know that the most efficient, quickest way to try and maybe cover a topic is, to have it teacher-centered. I can check off all the boxes and make sure all the aspects of that topic have been hit. But ultimately, when you start getting students to ask their own questions, and that's one of the reasons why I'm such a huge fan, question formulation technique, which comes out of the Right Question Institute. When kids are asking their own questions, they're really engaged, they're really invested. When I'm asking questions, they might be a little bit engaged or they might not. But I found that getting kids to ask questions and really be active collectors of knowledge and builders of knowledge, that really is the thing that makes me realize this is the way to go, not worksheets and not weekly pacing schedules, but students constructing the knowledge, not just me delivering it to them.
You're actually, I recorded some interviews last night and have somebody who's going to be on the show very soon that it talked about this question formulation technique. How would you summarize this for those who've never heard of this?
So the question formulation technique is a way to get students wondering about something, and it all starts with a question focus. So it could be maybe a rock, or it could be a photograph of a dead albatross with plastic in its gut. It could be anything that sparks curiosity and makes students start to wonder. And then what happens is you take them through a series of steps where they generate questions, they categorize those questions as open and closed, they start to flip open to closed questions and notice how does that change what we're asking. And then ultimately what happens is you start to prioritize the questions that the students have created and then decide on what you want to do with those. I know as a teacher, if I give students like a list of questions, 1 through 10, students probably already know where the priority questions are at the top. But when students are doing this process of asking the questions and generating and refining them, wow, it's a totally different kind of experience.
The book that you can download, the National Geographic Geo-Inquiry Education Guide, co-authored by Jim Bentley. We will link to it in the show notes because it is free and you can download that, as well as some of these other resources. I think that, the meaningful work, we don't want to have wastebasket work. We want our students to really feel like they're part of the process. And this whole project-based learning approach is something that so many of us have embraced. So remarkable teachers everywhere, I hope you'll take a look at this and kind of understand how can I adapt and use this in my classroom. Thanks, Jim.
Hey, thank you, Vicki.
From now until September 28th, Advancement Courses, an online provider of professional development for K-12 teachers, is donating 10% of their sales to funding DonorsChoose.org projects. Go to advancementcourses.com/give to submit your project today. And if you're in need of professional development, the 10-Minute Teacher listeners like you can get 20% off any online courses with the code COOL20. That's COOL 20. With this coupon, a 3 grad credit course for continuing education, salary advancement, or recertification is only $359. So go to advancementcourses.com/coolcat to learn more and make sure you use that coupon code COOL20. Never stop learning. Thank you for listening to the 10-Minute Teacher Podcast. You can download the show notes and see the archive at coolcatteacher.com/podcast. Never stop learning.